Serious, what is the scariest thing that you have ever encountered while home alone? I was babysitting a family I was unfamiliar with. My parents knew them and suggested me when they needed a babysitter, and as I liked having money, I accepted. The kids go to bed and I kill time as one does before smartphones are a thing by reading, I think. Maybe doing homework, but that seems unlikely. Anyways, I start to hear speaking from another room. Not just speaking, but this low, almost demonic voice speaking to another one. I'm not a religious sort, but when you realize that no, you're not just hearing things, there's definitely a voice, it's more than a little creepy. Not knowing what was going on, I slowly crept up to the doorway of the sitting room, then peered around the corner. Fucking Furbies. Talking to each other. At night. In the dark. Furbies suck. I'm pretty convinced that there's some whole story about the person that invented them was some sort of alchemist who needed to create a physical cage to trap demons in, and thus Furbies were made. And the things are practically indestructible. I mean, you can still find them in fully functional states at yard sales 15 to 20 years later. I'm sure if you do manage to break one, it releases the demon into the real world. But until then, the demon inside just annoys the owner until they get so frustrated that they destroy the monstrosity, which in turn releases it. I was watching TV alone like I do almost all the time, and a cat jumped up on my lap. I ain't got no fucking cat, okay? I was woken from a deep sleep by the most horrifying high-pitched howling noise. We lived deep in a wooded area, and I was familiar with sounds like foxes barking or even fisher cats screaming, but this was eerie and didn't sound like an animal. Then it came from the other side of the house, but there was no sound of anything walking. You know how your mind isn't really logical when you first wake? I was convinced it was some terrible otherworldly creature. In the morning I checked some online recordings of sounds to figure it out. Turned out to be a tiny harmless screech owl. Little guy can make some demonic sounds though. Just moved into our brand new home. My husband goes out to pick up dinner. I'm just setting up our TV and all of a sudden a man comes down the flipping stairs. I scream at the top of my lungs and run for the front door. He screams at the same time. Thankfully the neighbors next door were outside. ISQ week out that there is a strange man in my house. He comes out of my house and turns out he works for the development, and had been fixing a upstairs bathroom. My husband forgot to tell me he was there. Woman facepalming, medium skin tone. A tree branch crashed through my window when I was home alone playing Xbox. I've always thought I would be prepared for like an intruder or something, but if that was a dude that just like did that SWAT rope swing thing through my window, he would have had enough time to walk over to me, grab a gun from my hand, load it, and shoot me before I figured what the fuck went on. I was like one of those goats that faint when you scream at them. I was at a friend's house watching her cats, and suddenly someone stood on the balcony, right when I walked down the hallway. I stopped dead and stood frozen for minutes, heartbeat up in my throat. Turns out it was my reflection. Took me solid 10 minutes. Edit. Thanks for the award and great answers, smiley face. I was super high cleaning the apartment one day, probably around 1 p.m. So the music was up, I was in my zone. Then someone started slamming on the door. It kept going. I stopped the music, thinking that maybe it was just a neighbor who wanted the music turned down. I didn't feel like answering the door because 1, I smoked a fuckton of weed so was in no place to 2, COVID stopped the music, went quiet. But the aggressive knocking did not stop. So I looked through the peephole, smaller girl a bit bigger than my stature. Never seen her before, and I live in a complex with 6 units. So I know what my neighbors look like. But she keeps knocking. Being stupid, I opened the door. She just stared, asked where John was. I told her I don't know, there's no John here. She just stood and stared at me, definitely on something. I tell her to try down the hall, since I think there might be one that lives down there. I slowly go to close the door and she legit shoves her foot in the crack and starts to shove. So I start to struggle back. We are both actually wrestling with this door. I just go, "What? Can I help you?" I'm trying to close the door. She stops and relents a bit and does some weird eye shit and goes, "Oh, okay," then walks off. Locked and bolted that fucker real quick. But yeah, don't open doors to strangers. The first night alone at my new house, a dude tried scouting around my home looking for a way in. I flipped on all the lights and ran downstairs as loudly as I could, holding a plastic tomahawk in one hand, and my phone dialing 911 in the other. He never actually got inside the house, but it was terrifying, especially since it was literally my first night of living on my own. I was 11 and home alone. I got out of the shower to discover my house had been broken into. Teen from down the street and his sister were in the living room ransacking the place. My dad kept one of those glass door gun cabinets at the end of the hall by the bedroom door. I took out the first gun I could grab and yelled at them. Dude turned around with a knife but dropped and ran when he saw the rifle. Coward shoved his sister down as he bolted back out the door. The girl stayed on the ground screaming as I called the cops. They both got arrested over a pocket full of change the guy had shoved in his hoodie. This was in the 90s in Texas and my mom was more pissed about the broken door and them touching her change jar than anything. When the kids got a rifle you do not trifle. I had a massive tub of Lego fell over while I was eating downstairs. I kid you not, it sounded like somebody went through the window. I was frozen on the spot thinking I was going to be killed or kidnapped or something. An hour and a bit passed and I thought they must have left. I slowly went around the house looking for evidence of a break-in. Then I saw the Lego all over the floor. I was maybe 11 or 12 and was home alone one winter day. The desktop computer I was using shared a wall with our unheated garage. The house was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. All of a sudden this boom erupted from the garage that shook the wall. It honestly sounded like a bomb went off. 20 minutes later, after hiding behind the couch and getting my heart rate down, I finally went to inspect. A 2-liter Sprite bottle had frozen and exploded off the shelf. I was home alone since my husband was away on deployment. One night as I was falling asleep both my dog and I heard someone on the porch walking around. My dog flipped out and I decided to go downstairs. I grabbed my gun out of the safe and headed downstairs. About 2/3 of the way down I saw the man through the front door windows. We locked eyes and he said, "Let me in." I told him that he needed to leave. Again, "Let me in." I told him he needed to leave and that I was calling the cops. "Let me in." I told him I that had a gun. "So do I," and he lifted up a gun and aimed it at me. I fired my gun through the window but missed him. He ran off. The cops found him a few blocks from my house a little bit later. His gun ended up not being loaded. Still. Most terrifying shit ever. I was babysitting my little sister. We were both watching television. All of a sudden I hear gunshots and bullets ricocheting from the window security bars. A moment later I hear moaning and screams coming from my front door. It was a drive-by shooting. 3 teenagers were shot up and managed to crawl to my door seeking help. As a 14-year-old at the time, it was something I was definitely not prepared to handle. Screams of fucking foxes, as in mating. No joke, almost shat my pants the first time. Our garter snakes had gotten out of their cage. We searched everywhere but couldn't find them. Finally my husband went to bed and I stayed up watching TV for a while. We had one of those gigantic old console TVs we had gotten when someone was throwing it out. Suddenly one of the dust-covered wires came slithering out from behind the TV. I had read Stephen King's Dolores Claiborne not too long before, and in that book the crazy old lady thinks the wires in her house are coming alive. I had a moment of, holy crap, it's actually happening, before I realized it was one of the snakes. That got my blood pumping, you better believe. Was in the shower when I heard the door to my apartment being unlocked. Husband wasn't due back for several hours. Turns out it was the skeevy-ass building manager snooping around people's apartments when he thought they were not home. Reported him to the company that owned the building but nothing ever came of it. Moved out shortly after. We have an older home, and one day, one of the garage door springs broke. Not that uncommon it turns out, but new to me. Since they're under tension, it sounded like a bomb went off in the garage. I was probably about 12, newly allowed to be home alone for a couple hours over the summer. A man was walking through my fenced-in backyard, walked right onto my deck to the back window. My dog was going nuts barking with her hair standing up. I had no way out of the house or to the phone without this man seeing me in the window. So I'm hiding behind the couch waiting for him to break in when I see him exit my yard through the gate. I immediately call my mom almost in tears and she said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you the gas meter guy was coming." Of course the gas meter is right next to the window my brother and I always used to break in to our own house when we forgot our keys. My dog was the only badass that day. My husband was having a dude's weekend and I was home alone with our kid. The downstairs neighbors were fighting, nothing new there, when all of a sudden I heard her scream, "Help me please God, someone help me." So loud I knew she had run out the kitchen into the back stairwell. She was crying and screaming, their baby was screaming, then there were thumps and more yelling. I had already called 911 and while they were getting my information everything went silent down there. The baby suddenly stopped, everything was quiet. I told them to hurry. The police arrived and I had to let them in the building, so much for an anonymous report. And they pounded on the downstairs door for a while with no answer. They tried calling the landlord to get permission to break down the door but one officer came up to ask me if there was another way in. I showed them the back stairwell and said they were unlikely to have bothered locking the kitchen door. They hadn't, and the officers got in. Nobody home. They came back and asked me again what I'd heard, and another officer hung back. The family was finally found in the basement. He said they'd all been down there doing laundry and hadn't heard the police knocking. Bullshit. People down the block could hear them threatening to break down the door. We'd drawn quite a crowd. She insisted everything was fine and she and the baby were safe and sent the police on their way. Nothing they can do if she insists she's safe. I couldn't sleep all night, and they were extra cold to us after that. A few months later I answered the door to 2 police officers responding to a report of DV. The downstairs neighbors claimed they'd heard screaming and thumps and then saw my husband jump in his car and speed away. I was home alone, still in my nightgown, they could see lots of skin and no visible marks, and my husband had been out of the country on business for 3 days. They got in trouble for the false report and moved out later that month. I hope she eventually left him. I was taking a nap in my apartment under blankets in my bed when I hear the door open. Thinking it's my husband, I ignore it. But about 5 minutes later, I hear several female voices. I'm thinking I'm dreaming, so again, I ignore it. The voices get louder and suddenly my bedroom door opens. I freak out and bolt upright in bed. 3 women were in my apartment, 2 young, 1 older. I shriek. They shriek. They run out of my apartment. It turned out that the management company showed the wrong apartment available for rent that day. I got an apology and a bouquet of flowers. I lived in a house with some guys in college and was homesick with a cold. I was laid up in bed, half delirious from cold medicine and watching YouTube on my phone when there was a knock on my door. Thinking it was one of my roommates, I said, "Come in," and in walked my landlord and 4 random dudes. Because I was a bit delirious from the cold medicine, I immediately yelled, "Who are you people? What are you doing in our house?" The landlord's eyes went wide as saucers and he hurried the guys out of the room. Got a call later from him apologizing and saying he was showing the house to prospective renters and that one of my roommates had told him it was fine. My roommate probably told me, but again, I was so out of it from being sick and taking cold medicine that I completely forgot. We lived in a maisonette in London. We lived upstairs and a man was downstairs. He came banging at our door one day screaming that his flat was being flooded from our bathroom and to let him in. Well, I was 14 and my bro 13, mum was out. He came in, went into the bathroom and did something. I don't know what. He was an adult and we trusted him. Well, mum called the council out and there had never been a leak. No water marks or anything, so mum told us not to let him in again. Next time mum went out he came banging at the door again and we told him what mum said. He went apeshit. Let me fucking IIINN, let me fucking IIINN. All the while banging the fuck out of the door. God knows why he wanted in. Scary. Put a hidden camera in the bathroom. Had to fix it when it stopped working.